Hi there, welcome back, or welcome for the very first time. You're safe now. This is your time to rest. Let go of your day. Let your breath slow down and your thoughts float gently away. Tonight I'll be reading you a fairy tale, an old story wrapped in moonlight and carried on a quiet breeze just for you. So snuggle in, get cozy, and let the soft rhythm of the story guide you into dreams. Let's begin. Tonight we're going to read Welsh Rabbit and the Hunted Hares. Long, long ago, there was a good saint named David who taught the early Cymric or Welsh people better manners and many good things to eat and ways of enjoying themselves. Now, the Welsh folk, in speaking of their good teacher, pronounced his name Tafydd, and affectionately Taffy, and this came to be the usual name for a person born in Wales. In our nurseries, we all learned that Taffy was a Welshman, but it was their enemies who made a bad rhyme about Taffy. Wherever there were cows or goats, people could get milk, so they always had what was necessary for a good meal. Whether it were breakfast, dinner, or supper, milk, cream, curds, whey, and cheese enriched the family table. Were not these enough? But Saint David taught the people how to make a still more delicious food out of cheese, and that this could be done without taking the life of any creature. Saint David showed the girls how to take cheese, slice it and toast it over the coals, or melt it in a skillet and pour it hot over toast or biscuit. This gave the cheese a new and sweeter flavour. When spread on bread, either plain or browned over the fire, the result in combination was a delicacy fit for a king and equal to anything known. The fame of this new addition to the British bill of fare spread near and far. The English people, who had always been fond of rabbit pie and still eat thousands of molly cottontails every day, named it Welsh Rabbit, and it is thought that it was one of the best things to eat. In fact, there are many people who do not easily see a joke, who misunderstand the fun, or who suppose the name to be either slang or vulgar, or a mistake, and who call it rarebit. It is like the Cape Cod turkey, codfish, or Bombay ducks, dried fish, or Irish plums, potatoes, and such funny cookery with fancy names. Now, up to this time, the rabbits and hares had been so hunted with the aid of dogs that there was hardly a chance of any of them surviving the cruel slaughter. In the year 604, the Prince of Powys was out hunting. The dogs started a hare and pursued it into a dense thicket. When the hunter with the horn came up, a strange sight met his eyes. There he saw a lovely maiden. She was kneeling on the ground and devoutly praying. Although surprised at this, the prince was anxious to secure his game. He hissed on the hounds and ordered the horn to be blown, for the dogs to charge on their prey, expecting them to bring him the game at once. Instead of this, though they were trained dogs and would fight even a wolf, they slunk away howling and frightened as if in pain, while the horn stuck fast to the lips of the blower and he was silent. Meanwhile, the hare nestled under the maiden's dress and seemed not in the least disturbed. Amazed at this, the prince turned to the fair lady and asked, "Who are you?" She answered, "My mother named me Monacella. I have fled from Ireland, when my father wished to marry me to one of his chief men, whom I did not love. Under God's guidance, I came to this secret desert place where I have lived for 15 years without seeing the face of man." To this the prince in admiration replied, "O most worthy Melengesh," which is the way the Welsh pronounce Monicella, "because, on account of thy merits, it has pleased God to shelter and save this little wild hare. I, on my part herewith, present thee with this land, to be for the service of God, and an asylum for all men and women who seek thy protection. So long as they do not pollute this sanctuary, let none, not even prince or chieftain, drag them forth." The beautiful saint passed the rest of her life in this place. At night she slept on the bare rock. Many were the wonders wrought for those who with pure hearts sought her refuge. The little wild hares were under her special protection, and they are still called Melengesh's lambs. The end. Tonight we are reading story number 2, The Mighty Monster Avang. After the Cymric folk, that is, the people who call Welsh, had come up from Cornwall into their new land, they began to cut down the trees to build towns and have fields and gardens. Soon they made the landscape smile with pleasant homes, rich farms, and playing children. They trained vines and made flowers grow. The young folks made pets of the wild animals' cubs, which their fathers and big brothers brought home from hunting. Old men took rushes and reeds and wove them into cages for songbirds to live in. While they were draining the swamps and bogs, they drove out the monsters that had made their lair in these wet places. These terrible creatures liked to poison people with their bad breath, and even ate up the very little boys and girls when they strayed away from home. So all of the face of the open country between the forests became very pretty to look at. The whole of the Cymric land, which then extended from the northern Grampian hills to Cornwall, and from the Irish Sea past their big fort, afterward called London, even to the edge of the German Ocean, became a delightful place to live in. The lowlands and the rivers in which the tide rose and fell daily were especially attractive. This was chiefly because of the many bright flowers growing there, while all the yellow gorse and pink heather made the hills look lovely as a young girl's face. Beside this, the Cymric maidens were the prettiest ever, and the lads were all brave and healthy, while both of these knew how to sing often and well. Now there was a great monster named the Avang, who lived in a big bog hidden amongst the high hills and inside of a dark, rough forest. This ugly creature had an ironclad back and a long tail that could wrap itself around a mountain. It had 4 front legs with big knees that were bent up like a grasshopper's, but were covered with scales like armor. These were as hard as steel and bulged out at the thighs. Along its back was a ridge of horns like spines and higher than an alligator's. Against such a tough hide, when the hunters shot their darts and hurled their javelins, these weapons fell down to the ground like harmless pins. On this monster's head were big ears, halfway between those of a donkey and an elephant. Its eyes were as green as leeks, and were round but scalloped on the edges like squashes, while they were as big as pumpkins. The Avang's face was much like a monkey's or a gorilla's, with long straggling grey hairs around its cheeks like those of a walrus. It always looked as if a napkin as big as a bath towel would be necessary to keep its mouth clean, yet even then it slobbered a good deal, so that no nice fairy liked to be near the monster. When the Avang growled, The bushes shook, and the oak leaves trembled on the branches as if a strong wind was blowing. But after its dinner, when it had swallowed down a man, or 2 cows, or 4 sheep, or a fat heifer, or 3 goats, its body swelled up like a balloon. Then it usually rolled over, lay along the ground or in the soft mud, and felt very stupid and sleepy for a long while. All around its lair lay wagon loads of bones, and of the creatures, girls, women, men, boys, cows, and occasionally a donkey which it had devoured. But when the Avang was ravenously hungry and could not get at these animals, and when fat girls and careless boys were scarce, it would live on birds, beasts, and fishes. Although it was very fond of cows and sheep, yet the wool and hair of these animals stuck in its big teeth. It often felt very miserable, and its usually bad temper grew worse. Then, like a beaver, it would cut down a tree, sharpen it to a point, and pick its teeth until the mouth was clean. Yet it seemed all the more hungry and eager for fresh human victims to eat, especially juicy maidens, just as the children like cake more than bread. The Cymric men were not surprised at this, for they knew their girls were very sweet, and they almost worshipped women, so they learned to guard their daughters and wives. They saw that to do such things as eating up people was in the nature of the beast, which could never be taught good manners. But what made them mad beyond measure was the trick which the monster often played upon them by breaking the river banks and the dikes, on which great toil had been built to protect the crops. When the waters overflowed all their farms, ruining their gardens and spoiling their cowhouses and stables. This sort of mischief the Avang liked to play, especially about the time when the oat and barley crops were ripe and ready to be gathered to make cakes and flummery, that is, sour oat jelly or pap. So it often happened that the children had to do without their cookies and porridge during the winter. Sometimes the floods rose so high as to wash away the houses and float the cradles. Even those with little babies in them were often seen on the raging waters and sent dancing on the waves down the river to the sea. Once in a while, a mother cat and all her kittens were seen mewing for help, or a lady dog howling piteously. Often it happened that both puppies and kittens were drowned. So, whether for men or mothers, puppies or kittens, the Cymric men thought the time had come to stop this monster's mischief. It was bad enough that people should be eaten up, but to have all of their crops ruined and animals drowned, so that they had to go hungry all winter with only a little fried fish and no turnips, was too much for human patience. There were too many weeping mothers and sorrowful fathers, and squalling children and animals whining for something to eat. Besides, if all the oats were washed away, how could their wives make flummery, without which no Cymric man is ever happy? And where would they get seed for another year's sowing? And if there were no cows, how could the babies or kitties live, or any grown-up person get buttermilk? Someone may ask, why did not some brave man shoot the Avang with a poisoned arrow, or drive a spear into him under the arms, where the flesh was tender, or cut off his head with a sharp sword? The trouble was just here. There were plenty of brave fellows ready to fight the monster, but nothing made of iron could pierce that hide of his. This was like armor, or one of the steel battleships of our day, and the Avang always spit out fire or poisoned breath down the road up which a man was coming, long before the brave fellow could ever get near him. Nothing would do but to go into his lair and drag him out. But what man or company of men was strong enough to do this when a dozen giants in a gang with ropes as thick as a ship's hawser could hardly tackle the job? Nevertheless, in what neither man nor giant could do, a pretty maiden might succeed. True, she must be brave also, for how could she know but if hungry the Avang might eat her up? However, one valiant damsel of great beauty, who had lots of perfumery and plenty of pretty clothes, volunteered to bind the monster in his lair. She said, "I'm not afraid." Her sweetheart was named Gadern, and he was a young and strong hunter. He talked over the matter with her, and the two resolved to act together. Gadern went all over the country, summoning the farmers to bring their ox teams and log chains. Then he set the blacksmiths to work, forging new and especially heavy ones to make of the best native iron from the mines for which Wales is still famous. Meanwhile, the lovely maiden arrayed herself in her prettiest clothes, dressed her hair in the most enticing way, hanging a white blossom on each side over her ears, with one flower also at her neck. When she had perfumed her garments, she sallied forth and up the lake, where the big bog and waters were, and where the monster hid himself. While the maiden was still quite a distance away, the terrible Avang, scenting his visitor from afar, came rushing out of his lair. When very near, he reared his head high in the air, expecting to pounce on her with his iron-clad claws, and in one swallow make a breakfast of the girl. But the odours of her perfumes were so sweet that he forgot what he thought to do. Moreover, when he looked at her, he was so taken with unusual beauty that he flopped at once on his forefeet. Then he behaved just like a lovelorn beau when his best girl comes near, who ties his necktie and pulls on his coat and brushes off the collar. So the Avang began to spruce up. It was real fun to see how a monster behaves when smitten with love for a pretty girl. He had no idea how funny he was. And the girl was not at all afraid, but smoothed the monster's back, stroked and played with its big moustaches, and tickled its neck until the Avang's throat actually gurgled with a laugh. Pretty soon he guffawed, for he was so delighted. When he did this, the people down in the valley thought it was thunder, though the sky was clear and blue. The maiden tickled his chin and even put up his whiskers in curl papers. Then she stroked his neck so that his eyes closed. Soon she had gently lulled him to slumber by singing a cradle song which her mother had taught her. This she did so softly and sweetly that in a few minutes, with its head in her lap, the monster was sound asleep and even began to snore. Then quietly, from their hiding places in the bushes, Gadern and his men crawled out. When near the dreaded Avang, they stood up and sneaked forward very softly on tiptoe. They had wrapped the links of the chain in grass and leaves so that no clanking was heard, and they also held the oxen's yokes so that nobody or anything could rattle or make any noise. Slowly but surely they passed the chain over its body in the middle, besides binding the brute securely between its fore and hind legs. All this time the monster slept on, for the girl kept on crooning her melody. When the 40 yoke of oxen were all harnessed together, the drovers cracked all their whips at once, so that it sounded like a clap of thunder, and the whole team began to pull together. Then the Avang woke with a start. The sudden jerk roused the monster to wrath, and its bellowing was terrible. It rolled round and round, and dug its 4 sets of toes, each with 3 claws, every one as big as a ploughshare, into the ground. It tried hard to crawl into its lair or slip into the lake. Finding that neither were possible, the Avang looked about for some big tree to wrap its tail around, but all its writhings or plunging were of no use. The drovers plied their whips, and the oxen kept on with one long pull together and forward. They strained so hard that even one of them dropped its eye out. This formed a pool, and to this day they call it the pool of the ox's eye, as it never dries up or overflows, though the water in it rises and falls as regularly as the tide. For miles over the mountains the sturdy oxen hauled the monster. The pass over which they toiled and strained so hard is still named the Pass of the Oxen Slope. When going downhill, the work of dragging the Avang was easier. In a great hole in the ground, big enough to be a pond, they dumped the carcass of the Avang, and soon a little lake was formed. This uncanny bit of water is called the Lake of the Green Well. It is considered dangerous for man or beast to go too near it. Birds do not like to fly over the surface, and even when sheep tumble in, they sink to the bottom at once. If the bones of the Avang still lie at the bottom, they must have sunk down very deep, for the monster had no more power to get out, or to break the riverbanks. The farmers no longer cared anything about the creature, and they hardly ever think of the old story, except when a sheep is lost. As for Gadern and his brave and lovely sweetheart, they were married and lived long and happily. Their descendants, in the 37th generation, are proud of the grand exploit of their ancestors, while all the farmers honor his memory and bless the name of the lovely girl that put the monster to sleep. The end. Story 3. The Two Cat Witches. In old days, it was believed that the seventh son in a family of sons was a conjurer by nature. That is, he could work wonders like the fairies and excel the doctors in curing diseases. If he were the seventh son of a seventh son, he was himself a wonder of wonders. The story ran that he could even cure the shingles, which is a very troublesome disease. It is also called by a Latin name, which means a snake, because as it gets worse, it coils itself around the body. Now, the eagle can attack the serpent and conquer and kill this poisonous creature. To secure such power, Hugh, the conjurer, ate the flesh of eagles. When he wished to cure the serpent disease, he uttered words in the form of a charm which acted as a talisman and a cure. After wetting the red rash which had broken out over the sick person's body, he muttered, "He eagle, she eagle, I send you over 9 seas, and over 9 mountains, and over 9 acres of moor and fen, where no dog shall bark, no cow low, and no eagle shall higher rise." After that, the patient was sure that he felt better. There were always great rivalry between these conjurers and those who made money from the pilgrims at holy wells and visitors to the relic shrines. But this fellow named Hugh and the monks kept on mutually good terms. They often ate dinner together, for Hugh was a great traveller over the whole country, and always had news to tell to the holy brothers who lived in cells. One night, as he was eating supper at the inn, 4 men came in and sat down at the table with him. By his magical power, Hugh knew they were robbers and meant to kill him that night in order to get his money. So, to divert their attention, Hugh made something like a horn to grow up out of the table, and then laid a spell on the robbers, so they were kept gazing at the curious thing all night long, while he went to bed and slept soundly. When he rose in the morning, he paid his bill and went away, while the robbers were still gazing at the horn. Only when the officers arrived to take them to prison did they come to themselves. Now, at Betus Accord, that pretty place which has the name that sounds so funny to us Americans and suggests a girl named Betty, the co-ed at college, there was a hotel named the Inn of Three Kegs. The shop sign hung out in front. It was a bunch of grapes gilded and set below 3 small barrels. The inn was kept by 2 respectable ladies who were sisters. Yet in that very hotel, several travellers, while they were asleep, had been robbed of their money. They could not blame anyone, nor tell how the mischief was done. With the key in the keyhole, they had kept their doors locked during the night. They were sure that no one had entered the room. There were no signs of men's boots or of anyone's footsteps in the garden, while nothing was visible on the lock or the door to show that either had been tampered with. Everything was in order as when they went to bed. Some people doubted their stories, but when they applied to Hugh the conjurer, he believed them and volunteered to solve the mystery. His motto was, "Go anywhere and everywhere, but catch the thief." When Hugh applied one night for lodging at the inn, nothing could be more agreeable than the welcome and fine manners of the 2 hostesses. At supper time and during the evening, they all chatted together merrily. Hugh, who was never at a loss for news or stories, told about the various kind of people and the many countries he had visited, in imagination, just as if he had seen them all, though he had never set foot outside of Wales. When he was ready to go to bed, he said to the ladies, "It is my custom to keep a light burning in my room all night, but I will not ask for candles, for I have enough to last me till sunrise." So saying, he bade them good night. Entering his room and locking the door, he undressed, but laid his clothes near at hand. He drew his trusty sword out of its sheath and laid it upon the bed beside him, where he could quickly grasp it. Then he pretended to be asleep, and even snored. It was not long before, peeping between his eyelids, only half closed, he saw 2 cats come stealthily down the chimney. When in the room, the animals frisked about and then gambolled and romped in the most lively way. Then they chased each other around the bed, as if they were trying to find out whether Hugh was asleep. Meanwhile, the supposed sleeper kept perfectly motionless. Soon the 2 cats came over to his clothes, and one of them put her paw into the pocket that contained his purse. At this, with one sweep of his sword, Hugh struck at the cat's paw. The beast howled frightfully, and both animals ran for the chimney and disappeared. After that, everything was quiet until breakfast time. At the table, only one of the sisters was present. Hugh politely inquired after the other one, and he was told that she was not well, for which Hugh said he was very sorry. After the meal, Hugh declared he must say goodbye to both the sisters whose company he had so enjoyed the night before. In spite of the other ladies' many excuses, he was admitted to the sick lady's room. After polite greetings and mutual compliments, Hugh offered his hand to say goodbye. The sick lady smiled at once and put out her hand, but it was her left one. "Oh no," said Hugh with a laugh. "I never in all my life have taken anyone's left hand, and, beautiful as yours is, I won't break my habit by beginning now and here." Reluctantly, and as if in pain, the sick lady put out her hand. It was bandaged. The mystery was now cleared up. The two sisters were cats. By the help of bad fairies, they had changed their forms and were the real robbers. Hugh seized the hand of the other sister and made a little cut in it, from which a few drops of blood flowed, but the spell was over. "Henceforth," said Hugh, "you're both harmless, and I trust you will both be honest women." And they were. From that day they were like other women, and kept one of the best of those inns, clean, tidy, comfortable, and at modest prices, for which Wales is, or was, noted. Neither as cats with paws, nor landladies with soaring bills, did they ever rob travellers again. The End. Story 4. How the Cymry land became inhabited. In all Britain today, no wolf roams wild, and all the deer are all tame. Yet in the early ages, when human beings had not yet come into the land, the swamps and forests were full of very savage animals. There were bears and wolves by the thousands, beside lions and the woolly rhinoceros, tigers with terrible teeth like sabers. Beavers built their dams over the little rivers, and the great horned oxen were very common. Then the mountains were higher and the woods denser. Many of the animals lived in caves, and there were billions of bees and a great many butterflies. In the bogs were ferns of giant size, amid which terrible monsters hid that were always ready for a fight or a frolic. In so beautiful a land, it seemed a pity that there were no men and women, no boys or girls, and no babies. Yet the noble race of the Cymry, who we call the Welsh, were already in Europe, and lived in the summer land with the south. A great benefactor was born among them, who grew up to be a wonderfully wise man, and taught his people the use of bows and arrows. He made laws by which the different tribes stopped their continual fighting and quarrels, and united for the common good of all. He persuaded them to take family names. He invented the plough and showed them how to use it, making furrows in which to plant grain. When the people found that they could get things to eat right out of the ground from the seed they had planted, their children were wild with joy. No one ever loved babies more than these Cymry folk, and it was they who invented the cradle. This saved the hard-working mothers many a burden, for each woman had, besides rearing the children, to work for and wait on her husband. He was the warrior and the hunter, and she did most of the labor in both the house and the field. When there were many little brats to look after, a cradle was a real help to her. In those days, brat was the general name for little folk. There were good laws, about women especially, for their protection. Any rough or brutish fellow was fined heavily or publicly punished for striking one of them. By and by, this great benefactor encouraged his people to the brave adventure and led them in crossing the sea to Britain. Men had not yet learned to build boats with prow or stern, with keels and masts, or with sails, rudders, or oars, or much less to put engines in the bowels or iron chimneys for smokestacks, by which we see the mighty ships driven across the ocean without regard to wind or tide. This great benefactor taught his people to make coracles, and on these the whole tribe of thousands of Cumbric folk crossed over into Britain, landing in Cornwall. The old name of this shire meant the Horn of Gallia, or Wallia, as the new land was later named. We think of Cornwall as the big toe of the motherland. These first comers called it a horn. It was a funny sight to see these coracles, which they named after their own round bodies. The men went down to the riverside or the seashore, and with their stone hatchets they chopped down trees, they cut the reeds and osiers, peeled the willow branches, and wove great baskets shaped like bowls. In this work the women helped the men. The coracle is made strong by a wooden frame fixed inside the round edge, and by 2 crossboards which also served as seats. When they turned the wicker frame upside down and stretched the hides of animals over the whole frame and bottom, with pitch, gum, or grease, they covered up the cracks or seams. Then they shaped paddles out of the wood. When the coracle floated on the water, the whole family, daddy, mammy, kids, and any old aunts or uncles or granddaddies got into it. They waited for the wind to blow from the south over the northern land. At first the coracle spun around and round, but by and by each daddy could, by rowing or paddling, make the thing go straight ahead. So finally all arrived in the land now called Great Britain. Though sugar was not then known, or for 1,000 years later, the first thing they noticed was the enormous number of bees. When they searched, they found the rock caves and hollow trees full of honey, which had accumulated for generations. Every once in a while the bears, that so like sweet things, found out the hiding places of the bees and ate up the honey. The children were very happy in sucking the honeycomb, and the mothers made candles out of the beeswax. The newcomers named the country Honey Island. The brave Cymry men had battles with the other people who were already there. When anyone, young or old, died, their friends and relatives sat up all night guarding the body against wild beasts or savage men. This grew to be a very settled custom, and such meetings were called a wake. Everyone present did keep awake, and often in a very lively way. As the Cymry multiplied, they built many dons, or towns. All over the land today are names ending in don, like London, Croydon, showing where these villages were. But while occupied in things for the body, their great ruler did not neglect the matters of the mind. He found that some of his people had good voices and loved to sing. Others delighted in making poetry, so he invented or improved the harp and fixed the rules of verse and song. Thus, ages before writing was known, the Cymry preserved their history and handed down what the wise ones taught. Men might be born, live and die, come and go, like leaves on the trees. which expand in the springtime and fall in the autumn, but their songs and poetry and noble language never die. Even today, the Cymry love the speech of their fathers almost as well as they love their native land. Yet things were not always lovely in Honeyland, or as sweet as sugar. As the tribes scattered far apart to settle in this or that valley, some had fish, but no salt. Others had plenty of salt, but no fish. Some had all the venison and bear meat they wanted, but no barley or oats. The hill men needed what the men on the seashore could supply. From their sheep and oxen they got wool and leather, from the wild beasts fur to keep warm in the winter. So many of them grew expert in trade. Soon there were among them some very rich men who were the chiefs of the tribes. In time, hundreds of others learned how to traffic among the tribes and swap or barter their goods, for as yet there were no coins for money or bank bills. So they established markets or fairs to which the girls and boys liked to go and sell their eggs and chickens, for when the wolves and foxes were killed off, sheep and geese multiplied. But what hindered the peace of the land were feuds or quarrels, because men of one tribe thought they were braver or better looking than those of another tribe. The women were very apt to boast that they wore their clothes, which were made of fox and weasel skin, more gracefully than those in the tribe next to them. So there was much snarling and quarrelling in Cumberland. The people were too much like naughty children, or when kiddies are not taught good manners, to speak gently and be kind to one another. One of the worst quarrels broke out because in one tribe there were too many maidens and not enough young men for husbands. This was bad for the men, for it spoiled them. They had too many women to wait on them, and they grew to be very selfish. In what might be the next tribe, the trouble was the other way. There were too many boys, a surplus of men, and not nearly enough girls to go around. And when any young fellow, moping out his life alone and anxious for a wife, went a-courting in the next tribe, or in their vale, or on their hilltop, he was usually driven off with stones. Then there was a quarrel between the two tribes. Any young girl who sneaked out at night to meet her young man of another clan was, when caught, instantly and severely spanked. Then, with her best clothes taken off, she had to stand tied to a post in the marketplace a whole day. Her hair was pulled down in disorder, and all the dogs were allowed to bark at her. The girls made fun of the poor thing, while they all rubbed one forefinger over the other, pointing at her and cried, "Fie, for shame!" while the boys called her hard names. If it were known that the young man who wanted a wife had visited a girl in the other tribe, his spear and bow and arrows were taken away from him till the moon was full. The other boys and girls treated him roughly and called him hard names, but he dare not defend himself and had to suffer patiently. This was all because of the feud between the two tribes. This went on until the maidens in the valley, who were very many, while yet lovely and attractive, became very lonely and miserable, while the young men, all splendid hunters and warriors, multiplied in the hill country. They were wretched in mind because not one could get a wife, for all the maidens in their own tribe were already engaged or had been mated. One day news came to the young men on the hilltop that the valley men were all off on a hunting expedition. At once, without waiting a moment, the poor lonely bachelors plucked up courage. Then, armed with ropes and straps, they marched in as a whole body to the village in the valley below. There, each man seized a girl, not waiting for any maid to comb her hair or put on a new frock or pack up her clothes or carry a thing out of her home, and made off with her as fast as one pair of legs could move, with another pair on top. At first, this looked like a rough treatment for a lovely girl, thus to be strapped to a brawny big fellow. But after a while, the girls thought it was great fun to be married, and each one to have a man to scold and look after and boss around, for each wife inside her own hut was quite able to rule her husband. Each one of these new wives was delighted to find a man who cared so much for her, and to come after her and risk his life to get her, and each one admired her, his brave new husband. Yet the brides knew too well that the menfolk, fathers, brothers, uncles, and cousins would soon come back to attempt their recapture. And this is just what happened. When a runner brought to the valley men now far away news of the taking of their daughters, the hunters at once ceased chasing the deer and marched quickly back to get the girls and make them come home. The hillmen saw the band of hunters coming after their daughters, and they at once all took their new wives into a natural rocky fortress at the top of a precipice which overlooked the lake. This stronghold had only one entrance, a sort of a gateway of rocks, in front of which was a long, steep, narrow path. Here the hillmen stood to resist the attack and hold their prizes. It was a case of a very few defenders assaulted by a multitude, and the battle was long and bloody. The hillmen scorned to surrender and shot their arrows and hurled their javelins with desperate valor. They battled all day, from sunrise until the late afternoon, and when shadows began to lengthen, the stars one by one came out, and both parties, after setting sentinels, lay down to rest. In the morning, again, charge after charge was made. Sword beat against shield and helmet, and clouds of arrows were shot by the archers, who were well posted in favourable situations on the rocks. Long before noon, the field below was dotted, and narrow pass was choked with dead bodies. In the afternoon, after a short rest, refreshed with food, the valley men, though finding that only 4 of the hill fighters were alive, stood off at a distance with their longbows and shower of arrows, left not one to breathe. Now, thought the victors, we shall get our maidens back. So taking their time to wash off the blood and dust, and to bind up their wounds, and to eat their supper, they thought it would be an easy job to load all the girls on their ox carts and carry them home. But the valley brides, thus suddenly made widows, were too true to their brave husbands. So when they had seen the last of their lovers quiet in death, they stripped off all their ornaments and fur robes, until all stood together, each clad only in her own innocence, and as pure in their purpose as they were a company of druid priestesses. Then, chanting their death song, they marched in procession to the tall cliff that rose sheer after the water. One by one, each uttering the name of her beloved, leapt into the waves. Men at a distance, knowing nothing of the fight, and sailors and fishermen far off in the water, thought that a flock of white birds were swooping down from their eyrie into the sea to get their food from the fishes. But when none rose up above the waters, they understood, and later heard the whole story of the valor of the men and the devotion of the women. The solemn silence of night soon brooded over the scene. The men of the valley stayed only long enough to bury their own. Then they marched home, and their houses were filled with mourning. Yet they admired the noble sacrifice of their daughters and were proud of them. Afterwards, they raised stone monuments on the field of the battle. Today, this water is called the Lake of the Maidens, and the great stones seen near the beach are the memorials marking the place of the slain in battle. During many centuries, the ancient custom of capturing the bride with resistance from her male relatives was vigorously kept up. But in the course of time, however, this was turned into a mimic play with much fun and merriment. The end. Story number 5. The Boy That Was Named Trouble. In one of the many coeds or places with this name in ancient and forest-covered Wales, there was a man who had one of the most beautiful mares in all the world. Yet great misfortunes befell both this coed mare and her owner. Every night on the 1st of May, the mare gave birth to a pretty little colt. Yet no one ever saw or could ever tell what became of any one or all of the colts. Each and all, and one by one, they disappeared. Nobody knew where they were, or went, or what became of them. At last, the owner, who had no children and loved little horses, determined not to lose another. He girded on his sword, and with his trusty spear stood guard all night in the stable to catch the mortal robber, as he supposed he must be. When on this same night of May 1st, the mare foaled again, and the colt stood up on its long legs, the man greatly admired the young creature. It looked already as if it could, with its own legs, run away and escape from any wolf that should chase it, hoping to eat it up. But at this moment, a great noise was heard outside the stable. The next moment, a long arm with a claw at the end of it was poked through the window hole to seize the colt. Instantly the man drew his sword, and with one blow the claw part of the arm was cut off, and it dropped inside with the colt. Hearing a great cry and tumult outside, the owner of the mare rushed forth into the darkness. But though he heard howls of pain, he could see nothing, so he returned. There, at the door, he found a baby, with hair as yellow as gold, smiling at him. Besides its swaddling clothes, it was wrapped up in flame-coloured satin. As it was still night, the man took the infant to the bed and laid it alongside of his wife, who was asleep. Now, this good woman loved children, though she had none of her own, and so when she woke up in the morning and saw what was beside her, she was very happy, and she resolved to pretend that it was her own. So she told her women that she had borne the child, and they called him Gouri of the Golden Hair. The baby boy grew up fast, and when only 2 years old, was as strong as most children are at 6. Soon he was able to ride the colt that was born on the May night, and the two were as playmates together. Now it chanced that the man had heard the tale of Queen Rhiannon, wife of Powach, prince of David. She had become the mother of a baby boy, but it was stolen from her at night. The 6 serving women, whose duty it was to attend the queen and guard her child, were lazy and had neglected their duty. They were asleep when the baby was stolen away. To excuse themselves and be saved from punishment, they invented a lying story. They declared that Rhiannon had devoured the child, her own baby. The wise men of the court believed the story which the 6 wicked women had told, and Rhiannon, the queen, though innocent, was condemned to do penance. She was to serve as a porter to carry visitors and their baggage from outdoors into the castle. Every day for many months, through the hours of daylight, she stood in public disgrace in front of the castle of Narberth, at the stone block on which riders on horses dismounted from the saddle. When anyone got off at the gate, she had to carry him on her back into the hall. As the boy grew up, his foster father scanned his features closely, and it was not long before he made up his mind that Powach was his father and Rhiannon was his mother. One day, with the boy riding on his coat and with 2 knights keeping him company, the owner of the Coed mare came near the castle of Narberth. There they saw the beautiful Rhiannon sitting on the horse block at the gate. When they were about to dismount from their horses, the lovely woman spoke to them thus: "Chieftains, go no further thus. I will carry every one of you on my back into the palace." Seeing their looks of astonishment, she explained, "This is my penance for the charge brought against me of slaying my son and devouring him." One and all of the 4 refused to be carried, and went into the castle on their own feet. There Powach, the prince, welcomed them and made a feast in their honour. It being night, Rhiannon sat beside him. After dinner, when the time for storytelling had come, the chief guest told the tale of his mare and the colt, and how he cut the clawed hand and then found the boy on the doorstep. Then, to the joy and surprise of all, the owner of the Coed mare, putting the golden-haired boy before Rhiannon, cried out, "Behold, lady, here is thy son, and whoever they were who told the story and lied about your devouring your own child have done you a grievous wrong." Everyone at the table looked at the boy, and all recognized the lad at once as the child of Powach and Rhiannon. "Here ends my trouble, Pryderi," cried out Rhiannon. Thereupon one of the chiefs said, "Well, hast thou named thy child Trouble?" And henceforth Pryderi was his name. Soon it was made known by the vision and word of the bards and seers that all the mischief had been wrought by the wicked fairies, and that the 6 serving women had been under their spell when they lied about the queen. Powach, the castle lord, was so happy that he offered the man of Coed rich gifts of horses, jewels, and dogs. But this good man felt repaid in delivering a pure woman and loving mother from an undeserved shame and disgrace by wisdom and honesty according to common duty. As for Pryderi, he was educated as a king's son ought to be, in all gentle arts, and was trained in all manly exercises. After his father died, Pryderi became ruler of the realm. He married Kieva, the daughter of a powerful chieftain who had a pedigree as long as the bridle used to drive a 10-horse chariot. It reached back to Prince Casnar of Britain. Pryderi had many adventures, which are told in the Mabinogion, which is the great storehouse of Welsh hero wonder and fairy tales. The end. Story 6. The Golden Harp. Morgan is one of the oldest names in Cymric land. It means one who lives near the sea. Every day, for centuries past, tens of thousands of Welsh folk have looked out on the great blue plain of salt water. It is just as true, also, that there are all sorts of Morgans. One of these, named Taffy, was like nearly all Welshmen in that he was very fond of singing. The trouble in his case, however, was that no one but himself loved to hear his voice, which was very disagreeable. Yet of the sounds which he himself made, with voice or instrument, he was an intense admirer. Nobody could persuade him that his music was poor and his voice rough, and he always refused to improve. Now, in Wales, the bard or poet who makes up his poetry or song as he goes along is a very important person, and it is not well to offend one of these gentlemen. In French, they call such a person by a very long name, the improvisateur. These poets have sharp tongues and often say hard things about the people whom they do not like. If they used whetstones or stropped their tongues on leather, as men do their razors, to give them keener edge, their words could not cut more terribly. Now, on one occasion, Morgan had offended one of these bards. It was while the poetic gentleman was passing by Taffy's house. He heard the jolly fellow inside singing, first at the top and then at the bottom of the scale. He would drop his voice down on the low notes and then again rise to the highest until it ended in a screech. Someone on the street asked the poet how well he liked the music which he had heard inside. "Music," replied the bard with a sneer. "Is that what Morgan is trying? Why, I thought it was the first lowing of an aged cow, and then the yelping of a blind dog, unable to find its way. Do you call that music?" The truth was that when the soloist had so filled himself with strong ale that his brain was fuddled, then it was hard to tell just what kind of noise he was making. It took a wise man to discover the tune, if there were any. One evening, when Morgan thought his singing unusually fine and felt sorry that no one heard him, he heard a knock. Instead of going to the door to inquire or welcome the visitor, he yelled out, "Come in." The door opened, and there stood 3 tired-looking strangers. They appeared to be travelers. One of them said, "Kind sir, we are weary and worn, and would be glad of a morsel of bread. If you can give us a little food, we shall not trouble you further." "Is that all?" said Morgan. "See, there's a loaf and the cheese, with a knife beside them both. Take what you want and fill your bags. No man shall ever say Taffy Morgan denied anyone food when he had any himself." Whereupon the 3 travellers sat down and began to eat. Meanwhile, without being invited to do so, their host began to sing for them. Now the three travellers were fairies in disguise. They were journeying over the country from cottage to cottage, visiting the people. They came to reward all who gave them a welcome and were kind to them, but to vex and play tricks upon those who were stingy, bad-tempered, or of sour disposition. Turning to Taffy before taking leave, one of them said, "You have been good to us, and we are grateful. Now, what can we do for you? We have power to grant anything you may desire. Please tell us what you would like most." At this, Taffy looked hard in the face of the three strangers to see if one of them was the bard who had likened his voice, in its ups and downs, to a cow and a blind dog. Not seeing any familiar face, he plucked up his courage and said, "If you are not making fun of me, I'll take from you a harp, and, if I can have my wish in full, I want one that will play only lively tunes, no sad music for me." Here Morgan stopped. Again he searched their faces to see if any were laughing at him, and then proceeded, "And something else, if I can have it, but it's really the same thing I'm asking for." "Speak on. We are ready to do what you wish," answered the leader. "I want a harp, which, no matter how badly I may play, will sound out sweet and jolly music." "Say no more," said the leader, who waved his hand. There was a flood of light, and, to Morgan's amazement, there stood on the floor a golden harp. But where were the three travellers? They had disappeared in a flash. Hardly able to believe his own eyes, it now dawned upon him that his visitors were fairies. He sat down, back of the harp, and made ready to sweep the strings. He hardly knew whether or not he touched the instrument, but there rolled out volumes of lively music, as if the harp itself were mad. The tune was wild, and such as would set the feet of the young folks a-going, even in church. As Taffy's fingers seemed every moment to become more skillful, the livelier the music increased, until the very dishes rattled on the cupboard as if they wanted to join in. Even the chair looked as if about to dance. Just then, Morgan's wife and some neighbours entered the house. Immediately, the whole party, one and all, began dancing in the jolliest way. For hours they kept up the mad whirl, yet all the while Taffy seemed happier and the woman the merrier. No telegraph ever carried the news faster, all over the region, that Morgan had a wonderful harp. All the grass in front of the house was soon worn away by the crowds that came to hear and dance. As soon as Taffy touched the harp strings, the feet of everyone, young and old, began shuffling, nor could anyone stop as long as Morgan played. Even the very old, lame and one-legged people joined in. Several old women, whom nobody had ever prevailed upon to get out of their chairs, were cured of their rheumatism. Such unusual exercise was severe for them, but it seemed to be helpful. A shrewd monk, the business manager of the monastery nearby, wanted to buy Morgan's house and set up a sanitarium and advertise it as a holy place. He hoped thus to draw pilgrims to it and get it for a great reputation as a healing place for the lame and the halt, the palsied and the rheumatic. Thus the monastery would be enriched and all the monks get fat. But Taffy was a happy-go-lucky fellow who cared little about money and would not sell, for with his harp he enjoyed both fun and fame. One day, in the crowd that stood around his door waiting to begin to hop and whirl, Morgan espied the bard, who had compared his voice to a cow and a cur. The bard had come to see whether the stories about the harp were true or not. He found, to his own discomfort, what was the fact and the reality, which were not very convenient for him. As soon as the harp music began, his feet began to go up, and his legs to kick and whirl. The more Morgan played, the madder the dance, and the wilder the antics of the crowd. And in these the bard had to join, for he could not help himself. Soon they all began to spin round and round on the flagstones fronting the door, as if crazy. They broke the paling of the garden fence. They came into the house and knocked over the chairs and the sofa, even when they cracked their shins against the wood. They bumped their heads against the walls and ceiling, and some even scrambled over the roof and down again. The bard could no more stop his weary legs than he could call the others lunatics. To Morgan, his revenge was so sweet that he kept going until the bard's legs snapped and he fell down on top of people that had tumbled from sheer weariness because no more strength was left in them. Meanwhile, Morgan laughed until his jaws were tired and his stomach muscles ached. But no sooner did he take his fingers off the strings to rest them than he opened his eyes in wonder, for in a flash the harp had disappeared. He had made a bad use of the fairy's gift, and they were displeased, so both the monk and Morgan felt sorry. Yet the grass grew again when the quondam harper and singer ceased desolating the air with his quavers. The air seemed sweeter to breathe because of the silence. However, the fairies kept on doing good to the people of goodwill, and today some of the sweetest singers in Wales come from the poorest homes. The end. Story 7. The Great Red Dragon of Wales. Every old country that has won fame in history and built up a civilization of its own has a national flower. Besides this, some living creature, bird or beast, or it may be a fish on its flag. In places of honor, it stands as the emblem of the nation, that is, of the people, apart from the land they live on. Besides flag and symbol, it has a motto. That of Wales is, "Awake, it is light." Now, because the glorious stories of Wales, Scotland, and Ireland have been nearly lost in that of the mighty England, men have, at times, almost forgotten about the leek, the thistle, and the shamrock, which stand for the other 3 divisions of the British Isles. Yet each of these people has a history as noble as that of which the rose and the lion are emblems. Each has also a patron saint and civilizer. So we have St. George, St. David, St. Andrew, and St. Patrick, all of them white-souled heroes. On the Union flag, or standard of the United Kingdom, we see their crosses. The Lion of England, the Harp of Ireland, the Thistle of Scotland, and the Red Dragon of Wales represent the 4 people in the British Isles, each with its own speech, traditions, and emblems, yet all in unity and in loyalty, none excelling the Welsh, whose symbol is the red dragon. In classic phrase, we talk of Albion, Scotia, Cymru, and Hibernia. But why red? Almost all the other dragons in the world are white or yellow, green or purple, blue or pink. Why a fiery red colour like that of Mars? born on the banner of the Welsh archers who in old days won the battles of Crecy and Agincourt, and now seen on the crests of the town halls and city flags. In heraldry and in art, the red dragon is as rampant as when King Arthur sat with his knights at the Round Table. The red dragon has 4 three-toed claws, a long barbed tongue, and a tail ending like an arrowhead. With its wide wings unfolded, it guards those ancient liberties which neither Saxon, nor Norman, nor German, nor kings on the throne, whether foolish or wise, have ever been able to take away. No people on earth combine so handsomely loyal freedom and the larger patriotism, or hold in pure loyalty to the union of hearts and hands in the British Empire, which the sovereign represents, as do the Welsh. The Welsh are the oldest of the British peoples. They preserve the language of the Druids, bards, and chiefs of the primeval ages, which go back and far beyond any royal line in Europe, while most of their fairy tales are pre-ancient and beyond the dating. Why the Cymric dragon is red is thus told from times beyond human record. In those early days, after the Romans in the south had left the island, and the Cymric king, Vortigern, was hard pressed by the Picts and the Scots of the north. To his aid, he invited over from beyond the North Sea, or German Ocean, the tribes called the Long Knives, or Saxons, to help him. But once on the big island, these friends became enemies and would not go back. They wanted to possess all Britain. Vortigern thought this was treachery. Knowing that the Long Knives would soon attack him, he called his 12 wise men together for their advice. With one voice, they advised him to retreat westward, behind the mountains, into Cymru. There he must build a strong fortress, and there defy his enemies. So the Saxons, who were Germans, thought they had driven the Cymru beyond the western borders of the country, which was later called England, and into what they named the foreign or Welsh parts. Centuries afterwards, this land received the name of Wales. People in Europe spoke of Galatians, Wallacians, Belgians, Walloons, Alsatians, and others as Welsh. They called the new fruit imported from Asia walnuts, because the name Wales and Welsh were unheard of until after the 5th century. The place chosen for the fortified city of the Cymru was among the mountains. From all over his realm the king sent for masons and carpenters and collected materials for building. Then a solemn invocation was made to the gods by the Druid priests. These grand-looking old men were robed in white, with long snowy beards falling over their breasts, and they had milk-white oxen drawing their chariot. With a silver knife they cut the mistletoe from the tree branch, hailing it as a sign of favour from the gods. Then, with harp, music, and song, they dedicated the spot as a stronghold of the Cymric nation. Then the king set the diggers to work. He promised a rich reward to those men of the pick and shovel who should dig the fastest and throw up the most dirt. so that the masons could, at the earliest moment, begin their part of the work. But it all turned out differently from what the king expected. Some dragon or powerful being underground must have been offended by this invasion of his domain, for the next morning they saw that everything in the form of stone, timber, iron, or tools had disappeared during the night. It looked as if an earthquake had swallowed them all up. Both king and seers, priests and bards, were greatly puzzled at this. However, not being able to account for it, and the Saxons likely to march on them at any time, the sovereign set the diggers at work and again collected more wood and stone. This time even the women helped, not only to cook the food, but to drag the logs and stones. They were even ready to cut off their beautiful long hair to make ropes, if necessary. But in the morning, all had again disappeared, as if swept by a tempest. The ground was bare. Nevertheless, all hands began again, for all hearts were united. For the third time the work proceeded, yet when the sun rose the next morning, there was not even a trace of either material or labour. What was the matter? Had some dragon swallowed everything up? Vortigern again summoned his 12 wise men to meet in council and to inquire concerning the cause of the marvel and to decide what was to be done. After a long deliberation, and while all the workmen and people outside waited for their verdict, the wise men agreed upon a remedy. Now, in ancient times, it was a custom all over the world, and among our ancestors, that when a new castle or bridge was to be built, they sacrificed a human being. This was done either by walling up the victim while alive, or by mixing his or her blood with the cement used in the walls. Often it was a young one, thus chosen by lot, to be sacrificed for the many. The idea was not only to ward off the anger of the spirits of the air, or to appease the dragons underground, but also to make the workmen do their best work faithfully, so that the foundation should be sure and the edifice withstand the storm, the wind, and the earthquake shocks. So nobody was surprised, or raised eyebrows, or shook his or her head, or pursed up lips, when the king announced that the wise men had declared, and it must be done quickly. Nevertheless, many a mother hugged her darling more closely to her bosom, and fathers feared for their sons or daughters, lest one of these, their own, should be chosen as the victim to be slain. King Vortigern had the long horn blown for perfect silence, and then he spoke. A child who must be found, who was born without a father. He must be brought here and solemnly put to end. Then his blood will be sprinkled on the ground, and the citadel will be built securely. They were dispatched in search of a boy without a father, and a large reward was promised to the young man or woman who found what was wanted. So in every part of the Cymric land the searchers went. One messenger noticed some boys playing ball. 2 of them were quarrelling. Coming near, he heard one say to the other, "Oh, you boy without a father, nothing good will ever happen to you." "This must be the one looked for," said the royal messenger to himself. So he went up to the boy who had been thus twitted and spoke to him thus. "Don't mind what he says." Then he prophesied great things if he would go along with him. The boy was only too glad to go, and the next day the lad was brought before King Vortigern. The workmen and their wives and children, numbering thousands, had assembled for the solemn ceremony of dedicating the ground by shedding the boy's blood. In strained attention, the people held their breath. The boy asked the king, "Why have your servants brought me to this place?" When the sovereign told him the reason, the boy asked, "Who instructed you to do this?" "My wise men told me to do so, and even the sovereign of the land obeys his wise counselors." "Order them to come to me, your majesty," pleaded the boy. When the wise men appeared, the boy, in respectful manner, inquired of them thus: "How was the secret of my life revealed to you? Please speak freely and declare who it was that discovered me to you." Turning to the king, the boy added, "Pardon my boldness, your majesty. I soon shall reveal the whole matter to you. But first, I wish to question your advisors. I want them to tell you what is the real cause, and reveal, if they can, what is hidden here underneath the ground." But the wise men were confounded. They could not tell and fully confess their ignorance. The boy then said, "There is a pool of water down below. Please order your men to dig for it." At once, spades were plied by strong hands, and in a few minutes the workmen saw their faces reflected, as in a looking-glass. There was a pool of clear water there. Turning to the wise men, the boy asked before all, "Now, tell me, what is in the pool?" As ignorant as before, and now thoroughly ashamed, the wise men were silent. "Your Majesty, I can tell you, even if these men cannot. There are 2 vases in the pool." 2 brave men leapt into the pool. They felt around and brought up 2 vases, as the boy had said. Again, the lad put a question to the wise men: "What is in these vases?" Once more, those who professed to know the secrets of the world, even to the demanding of a life of a human being, held their tongues. "There is a tent in them," said the boy. "Separate them, and you will find it so." By the king's command, a soldier thrust in his hand and found a folded tent. Again, while all wondered, the boy was in command of the situation. Everything seemed so reasonable that all were prompt and alert to serve him. "What a splendid chief and general he would make to lead us against our enemies, the Long Knives," whispered one soldier to another. "What is in the tent?" asked the boy of the wise men. Not one of the 12 knew what to say, and there was an almost painful silence. "I will tell you, your Majesty, and all hear what is in this tent. There are 2 serpents, one white and one red. Unfold the tent." With such a leader, no soldier was afraid, nor did a single person in the crowd draw back. 2 stalwart fellows stepped forward to open the tents. By now, a few of the men and many of the women shrank back, while those that had babies or little folk snatched up their children, fearing lest the poisonous snakes might wriggle towards them. The 2 serpents were coiled up and asleep, but they soon showed signs of waking, and their fiery, lidless eyes glared at the people. "Now, your Majesty and all here, be you the witnesses of what will happen. Let the king and wise men look in the tent." At this moment the serpents stretched themselves out at full length, while all fell back, giving them a wide circle to struggle in. Then they reared their heads, with their glittering eyes flashing fire. They began to struggle with each other. The white one rose up first, and threw the red one down in the middle of the arena, and then pursued him to the edge of the round space. 3 times did the white serpent gain victory over the red one. But while the white serpent seemed to be gloating over the other for the final onset, the red one, gathering strength, raised its head and struck at the other. The struggle went on for several minutes, but in the end, the red serpent overcame the white, driving it first out of the circle, then from the tent and into the pool, where it disappeared, while the victorious red one moved into the tent again. When the tent flap was opened for all to see, nothing was visible except a red dragon, for the victorious serpent had turned into this great creature, which combined in one new form the body and the powers of bird, beast, reptile, and fish. It had wings to fly, the strongest of animal strength, and could crawl and swim and live in either water or air or on the earth as it pleased. In its body was the sum total of all life. Then, in the presence of all the assembly, the youth turned to the wise men to explain the meaning of what had happened, but not a word did they speak. In fact, their faces were full of shame before the great crowd. Now, your majesty, let me reveal to you the meaning of this mystery. Speak on, said the king, gratefully. This pool is the emblem of the world, and the tent is that of your kingdom. The two serpents are the two dragons. The white serpent is the dragon of the Saxons, who now occupy several of the provinces and districts of Britain and from sea to sea. And when they invade our soil, our people will finally drive them back and hold fast forever the beloved Cymric land. But you must choose another site on which to erect your castle. After this, whenever a castle was to be built, no more human victims were doomed to their end. All the 12 men who had wanted to keep up the cruel custom were treated as deceivers of the people. By the king's orders, they were all put to their end and buried before all the crowd. Today, like so many who keep alive the old and worn-out notions by means of deception and falsehood, these men are remembered only by the 12 mounds which rise on the surface of the field hard by. As for the boy, he became a great magician, or, as we in our age would call him, a man of science and wisdom, named Merlin. He lived long on the mountain, but when he went away with a friend, he placed all his treasures in a golden cauldron and hid them in a cave. He rolled a great stone over its mouth, and then, with sword and earth, he covered it all over so as to hide it from view. His purpose was to leave this, his wealth, for a leader who, in some future generation, would use it for the benefit of his country when most needed. This special person will be a youth with yellow hair and blue eyes, and when he comes to Dinas, a bell will ring to invite him into the cave. The moment his foot is over the place, the stone of entrance will open of its own accord. Anyone else would be considered an intruder, and it would not be possible for him to carry away the treasure. The end. Story 10. The Maiden of the Green Forest. Many a palace lies under the waves that wash Cymric land, for the sea has swallowed up more than one village and even cities. When Welsh fairies yield to their mortal lovers and consent to become their wives, it is always on some condition or promise. Sometimes there are several of these, on which the fairy ladies compel their mortal lovers to pledge them before they agree to become their wives. In fact, the fairies in Cymric land are among the most exacting of any known. A prince named Benchley of the Powys region found this out to his grief, for he had always supposed that wives could be had simply for the asking. All a man need say to the girl to whom he took fancy was this: "Come along with me and be my bride." And then she would say, "Thank you, I'll come," and the two would trot off together. This was the man's notion. Now Benchley was a wicked old fellow. He was already married, but wrinkles had gathered on his wife's face. She had a faded, washed-out look, and her hair was thinning out. She would never be young again, and he was tired of her, and wanted a mate with fresh, rosy cheeks and long, thick hair. He was quite ready to fall in love with such a maiden, whenever his eyes should light upon her. One day he went out hunting in the green forest. While waiting for a wild boar to rush out, there rode past him a young woman whose beauty was dazzling. He instantly fell in love with her. The next day, while on horseback at the same opening in the forest, the same maiden reappeared, but it was only for a moment, and then she vanished. Again, on the third day, the prince rode out to the appointed place, and again the vision of beauty was there. He rode up to her and begged her to come and live with him at his palace. "I will come and be your wedded wife on 3 conditions. You must put away the wife you now have. You must permit me to leave you one night in every 7 without following after or spying upon me. And you must not ask me where I go or what I do. Swear to me that you will do these 3 things, and then, if you keep your promises unbroken, my beauty shall never change, no, not until the tall vegetable flag reeds wave, and the long green rushes grow in your hall." The Prince of Powys was quite ready to swear this oath, and he solemnly promised to observe the 3 conditions. So the maid of the green forest went to live with him. "But what of his old wife?" one asks. Ah, he had no trouble from that quarter, for when the newly wedded couple arrived at the castle, she had already disappeared. Happy indeed were the long bright days which the prince and his new bride spent together, whether in the castle or outdoors, riding on horseback or in hunting the deer. Every day her beauty seemed diviner, and she was more lovely. He lavished various gifts upon her, among others that of a diadem of beryl and sapphire. Then he put on her finger a diamond ring worth what was a very great sum, a king's ransom. In Middle Ages, monarchs, as well as nobles, were taken prisoner in battle, and large amounts of money had to be paid to get them back again. So a king's ransom is what Benchley paid for his wife's diamond ring. He loved her so dearly that he never suspected for even a moment that he would ever have any trouble in keeping his 3 promises. But without variety, life has no spice, and monotony wearies the soul. After 9 years had passed, and his wife absented herself every Friday night, he began to wonder why it could be. His curiosity to know the reason for her going away so increased that it wore on him, and he became both miserable in himself and irritable towards others. Everybody in the castle noticed the change in their master and grieved over it. One night, he invited a learned monk from the White Monastery not far away to come and take dinner with him. The table in the great banqueting hall was spread with the most delicious viands. The lights were magnificent, and the music was lovely. But Wyland, The monk was a man of magic and could see through things. He noticed that some secret grief was preying upon the prince's mind, and he discerned that, amidst all this splendor, he, Benchley, the lord of the castle, was the most miserable person within its walls. So Wyland went home, resolved to call again and find out what was the trouble. When they met some days later, Wyland's greeting was this: "Christ save thee, Benchley. What secret sorrows cloud thy brow? Why so gloomy?" Benchley at once burst out with the story of how he met the maid of the Green Forest, and how she became his wife on 3 conditions. "Think of it," said Benchley, groaning aloud. "When the owls cry and the crickets chirp, my wife leaves my bed, and until the day star appears, I lie alone, torn with curiosity to know where she is and what she is doing. I fall again into heavy sleep and do not awake until sunrise, when I find her by my side again. It is all such a mystery that the secret lies heavy on my soul. Despite all my wealth and my strong castle, with feasting and music by night and hunting by day, I am the most miserable man in the Cumbric land. No beggar is more wretched than I." Wyland, the monk, listened, and his eyes glittered. There came into his head the idea of enriching the monastery. He saw his chance and improved on it at once. He could make money by solving the secret for a troubled soul. "Prince Benchley," said he, "if you will bestow upon the monks of the White Minster 1/10 of all the flocks that feed within your domain, and 1/10 of all that flows into the vaults of your palace, and hand over the maiden of the Green Forest to me, I shall warrant that your soul will be at peace and your troubles at an end." To all this Prince Benchley agreed, making solemn promise. Then the monk Wyland took his book, leather-bound and kept shut by means of metal clasps, and hid himself in the cranny of a rock near the giant's cave, from which there was an entrance down into fairyland. He had not long to wait, for soon, with a crown on her head, a lady royally arrayed passed by out of the silvery moonlight into the cave. It was none other than the maiden of the Green Forest. Now came a battle of magic and spells, as between the monk's own and those of the Green Forest maiden. He moved forward into the mouth of the cave. Then, summoning into his presence the spirits of the air and the cave, he informed them as to Benchley's vow to enrich the monastery and deliver the Green Forest maiden to himself. Then, calling aloud, he said, "Let her forever be as she now appears, and never leave my side. Bring her, before the break of day, to the cross near the town of the White Minster, and there will I wed her and swear to make her my own." Then, by the power of his magic, he made it impossible for any person or power to recall or hinder the operation of these words. Leaving the cave's mouth in order to be at the cross before the day should dawn, the first thing he met was a hideous ogress, grinning and rolling her bleared red eyes at him. On her head seemed what was more like moss than hair. She stretched out a long, bony finger at him. On it flashed the splendid diamond which Benchley had given his bride, the beautiful maid of the Green Forest. "Take me to thy bosom, Monk Wyland," she shrieked, laughing hideously and showing what looked like green snags in her mouth. "For I am the wife you are sworn to wed. 30 years ago I was Benchley's blooming bride. When my beauty left me,
His love flew out the window. Now I am a foul ogress, but magic makes me young again every 7th night. I promised that my beauty should last until the tall flag reeds and long green rushes grow in his hall. Amazed at her story, Wyland drew in his breath. And this promise I have kept. It is already fulfilled. Your spell and mine are both completed. Yours brought him to the peace of the dead. Mine made the river floods rush in. Now waters lap to and fro among the reeds and rushes that grow in the banqueting hall, which is now sunk deep below the earth. With the clash of our spells, no charm can redress our fate. Come then, and take me as thy bride, for oath and spell have both decreed it as thy reward, as Benchley's promise to you is fulfilled, for the waters flow in the palace vaults, the pike and the dare feed there. So, caught in his own dark and sordid plot, the monk who played conjurer had become the victim of his own craft. They say that Wyland's cross still recalls the monk, while fishermen on the Welsh border can, on nights with smooth waters, see towers and chimney far below, sunk beneath the waves. The end.
Story 12. Giant Tom and the Giant Blub. Everyone who has read anything of Welsh history, though not of the sort that is written by English folks, knows that also that Cornwall is, in soul, a part of Wales. Before the Romans first and the Saxons next invaded Britain, the Cymric people lived all over the island south of Scotland. They were the British people, and nobody ever heard the German name Wales, which means a foreign land, or the word Welsh, which refers to foreigners, until men who were themselves outsiders came into Britain. Since that time, it has been much the same as when a British Jack Tar, when rambling in Portugal or China, calls the native foreigners and tells them to get out of the way. Ages ago, when the Cymric men with their wives and little ones rode over in their coracles from Gallia or the Summerland to Britain, the Honeyland, they first came to the promontory which we know as Cornwall, that is, the Cornu Gaea or Waiea, which means horn or cape of the new country now called England. Here was a new region, rich in every kind of minerals, ages before the Phoenicians had named it Britain or the land of tin. Within the memory of men now living, Cornishmen, that is, the miners of Cornwall, on going to California, discovered gold. In Cornwall, as part of the Cymric realm, King Arthur found and married Guinevere, his queen. It was in Cornwall also that Merlin was hidden. Here is the rhyme. Marvellous Merlin is wasted away by a wicked woman. Who may she be? For she hath pent him in a crag on Cornwall coast. So it happens that thousands of English people in Cornwall are Welsh, both by name or descent, or have translated their names into English form, even while keeping the Welsh meaning. They are also Welsh in traits of character, just as tens of thousands of Welsh folks among the first settlers of New England and the American colonies are described in our histories as English people. Now, in early Cornwall, there were many giants. Some were good, but others were bad. One of these, a right fine fellow, was named Tom, and the other, a bad one, was named Blub. This giant had 20 wives and was awfully cruel. Nobody ever knew what became of the 20 maidens he had married. Sometimes people called the big fellow that lived in a castle Giant Blunderbuss, but Blub was his name for short. He was much taller than the highest hop pole in Kent, and he was made up of mostly head and stomach, for his chief idea in living was to eat. His skull was as big as a hogshead or a pushball or a market wagon loaded with carrots. Indeed, it was strongly suspected by most people that the big bone box set on his shoulders was as hollow inside as a pumpkin, but that a coconut would hold all the brains he had. At any rate, during one of his fights with another giant, he had been given an awful thwack from the other giant's club. Then the sound made, which was heard a long distance away, was exactly like that when one pounds on an empty barrel. Now, this giant Blub had built a mighty castle between a big hill and a river. Under it were vaults of vast size, filled with treasures of all sorts, gold, silver, jewels, and gems. There were cells in which he kept his wives after he had married them. It was the opinion of his neighbours that in every case, soon after the honeymoon was over, he ate them up. Yet, even if the devil ought to have his due, one should be fair to this human monster, and we are bound to say that Giant Blub denied these stories as pure gossip. It is certain that such crimes as murder and cannibalism never could be proved against him. To guard his underground treasures, he had 2 huge and fierce dogs, supposed to be named Catch'em and Tear'em. What they were really called by their master was a secret. Yet anyone who had a piece of meat ready to throw for them, and knew their names, which were passwords, could first quiet them. Then he could walk by them and get the treasure. Beside these dogs, the only living thing left in the castle when the giant went out was the latest Mrs. Blub. Yet she was in constant fear of her life, lest her big husband should sometime make a meal of her. For even she had heard the story that Blub was a cannibal, and looked at all plump women simply as delicacies, exactly as a boy peers into the window of a candy shop. What made all the country round hate this cruel giant was not wholly on account of his awful appetite. It was because he had ruined the High King's Road. Ever since the time of King Lud, whose name we read in Ludgate Hill, in London, where his Cymric Majesty had lived, this highway had been free to all. It ran all the way through Cornwall, from Penzance, and thence eastward to London and beyond. When Giant Blub wished to enlarge his castle, he had the walls and towers built down to the river's edge. This closed up the big road, so that people had to go far around and up over the hill or by boat along the river. Such a roundabout way took much time and toil, and was was too much trouble for all. Everybody had to submit to this extortion until there came along Giant Tom, of whom we shall now tell. His real name was Rolling Stone, for he never stuck long in one place at a job, and cared not a cucumber for money or fine clothes. This jolly fellow was a very good-natured person and quite popular, but often very lazy. His mother talked to him many times, urging him to learn a trade or in some way make an honest living. She found it very hard to keep anything in her larder, barn, pantry, or cellar when he was at home. He measured 4 feet across at his shoulders, and at every meal he ate what would feed 3 big men. But as he could do 6 men's work when he had a mind to, as he often did, he was always welcome. In fact, he was too popular for his own good. One day, when 10 common fellows were trying their utmost to lift a big, long log on a cart, and were unable to do it, Tom came along and told them to stand back. When he hoisted the tree onto the wain, roped it in place, and told the cartmen to drive on, they all cheered him, and one of them lifted up his Monmouth cap and cried out, "Hurrah for Giant Tom! He is the fellow to whip Giant Blub." "He is! He is!" they all cried in chorus. "Who is this Giant Blub, and where does he live?" asked Tom, rolling up his sleeves, for he was just spoiling for a row with a fellow of his size. Then they told the story of how the big bully had ruined the king's highway by building a great wall and tower across the road to shut it up, to the grief of many honest men. "Never mind, boys, I'll attend to his bacon," said Tom. "Leave the matter to me, and don't bother to tell the king about it." Tom went the next day into town and hired himself out to a beer brewer to drive the wagon. Perhaps he hoped also, while in this occupation, to keep down his thirst. He asked the boss to give him the route that led past Giant Blub's castle over the old king's highway. The master of the brewery saw through Tom's purpose. He winked and only said, "Go ahead, my boy. I'll pay you double wages if you open that road again. But see that Giant Blub does not get my load of kegs, or that your carcass doesn't count with those of the 20 wives in his vaults and make 21. Again he winked his eye knowingly to his workmen. Tom drove off. He occupied all the room on the seat of the cart, which 2 men usually filled, and left plenty of room on either side. Cracking his whip, the new driver kept the 4 horses on a galloping pace, until very soon he called out "Whoa!" before the frowning high gateway of Giant Blub. Tom shouted from the depth of his lungs, "Open the gate and let me drive through. This is the king's highway." The only reply for a minute was the barking of the curs. Then a rattling of bolts was heard, and the great gates swung open. "Who are you, impudent fellow? Go round over the hill, or I'll thrash you," blustered Giant Blub in a rage. "Better to save your breath to cool your porridge, you big boaster. Come out and fight," said Tom. "Fight, you pygmy. I'll just get a switch and whip you, as I would a bad boy." Thereupon, Giant Blub stepped aside and into the grove nearby, keeping all the while an eye on his gate, guarded by his 2 monstrous dogs. he selected an elm tree 20 feet high and tore it up by the roots, pulled off the branches, and peeled it for a whip. This he jerked up and down to make ready for his task of thrashing the pygmy. Meanwhile, Giant Tom upset the wain, drew out the tongue, and took off one of the wheels. Then, as if armed with a spear and shield, he advanced to meet Giant Blub. He whistled like a boy as he went forward. In a passion of rage, Giant Blub lifted his elm switch to strike, but Tom warded off the blow with his wheel shield. Then he punched him in the stomach with the wagon tongue so hard that the big fellow slipped and rolled over in the mud. Picking himself up, Giant Blub, now half blind with rage, rushed against Tom, who, this time, made a lunge which planted the cart tongue inside Blub's bowels and knocked him over. But Tom was not a cruel fellow and had no desire to kill anyone, so he threw down his war tools and, tearing up a yard or two of grassy sod, rolled it together and made a plug of it, as big around as a milk churn. With this, he stopped up the big hole in Giant Blub's huge body. But instead of thanking Tom, Giant Blub rushed at him. He was in too much of a rage to see anything clearly, while Tom, perfectly cool, gave the angry monster such a kick in a place where he kept his dinner that he rolled over, and Tom gave him another kick. Then the plug of sod fell out of his wound. As he was bleeding to death, Giant Blub beckoned to Tom to come closer, for he could only whisper, "You've beaten me on the square, and I like you. Don't think I killed my 20 wives. They all died naturally. But you call the dogs by name, and they will let you pass. Then, in my vaults, you'll find gold, silver, and copper. Make these your own, and bury me decently. This is all I ask." Tom made himself owner of the castle and all its treasures. He opened the king's highway again and took care of his aged mother, married the 21st wife of Giant Blub, now a widow, and was always kind to the sick and the poor. Today in Cornwall, they still tell stories of the big fellow who abolished Giant Blub's toll gate. Centuries afterward, when the gospel came into the land, they restored Giant Tom's tomb, and on it were chiseled these words, "The restorer of paths to dwell in." The end. The story has ended, but your dreams are just beginning. Let them carry you gently through stars and silence and soft wonder. Thank you for letting me read to you. I'll be here again whenever you need a quiet voice and a gentle tale. Sleep well, sleep deep, and good night, dear dreamer. Breuddwydion melys, dear dreamer, sweet dreams.